given at this point in time, I think you all know Ryan Ball, so he needs no introduction. He will introduce the moderators. So over to you, Ryan.
Thank you. Okay, so for our third session, and last one of the morning, or around noontime, I guess, prior to lunch, we have what I consider three shining examples of some good macroeconomics research and accounting. And each of the panelists is here to talk about some of the research they've done or are doing currently, so it's good to hear from the academics perspective. First, we'll hear from Shiva Kumar, who's a professor of accounting at London Business School. He'll not only talk about his research, but he also serves as editor of two of our top journals in accounting, and so he's actually going to put on his editorial hat too and give a broad brush perspective of where, as accountants, we can kind of contribute and some of the issues that revolve around that more generally. Then we'll hear from Gil Saka, associate professor at UT Dallas. And finally, Maria Ogneva from USC will wind down the panel. We'll have Q&A at the end. These guys like to talk a lot, so if we have time permitting, we'll have some Q&A. After that, lunch.
Thank you. Oh, we've got that. Okay. Let me take this opportunity to thank the organizers. This is something, first of all, macro accounting is a very important field for me. I'm very passionate about it, and I've always wanted to have a place to interact with macroeconomists, and this has been a fantastic opportunity. So thanks a lot to the organizers for making this happen. Okay, I want to start off by asking a very simple question. Why macro accounting? Should accountants thread in the field of macroeconomics? Okay, and why is this question being posed? First of all, I've had some editor in accounting who has spoken to me and said, like, look, I don't think accountants should do macroeconomics work because it doesn't speak anything to standard setting. Okay? And so let's leave the macroeconomists to their work and let's do our work, which is to focus on standard setting. And in fact, another interesting thing is if you go outside this room and talk to macroeconomists or talk to finance people or a lot of other areas as well and say, so what do you think about macroeconomics and accounting? Do you think these fields are related? They'll say, not much at all. You know, they are completely different fields. I don't know what you can do by bringing them together. So because of all these feelings out there, I just wanted to give a bit of sense about where macroeconomics and accounting actually are. And in fact, when you take a big picture look at these two fields, they are not very different. Macroeconomists are also measuring performance. They're measuring performance across many sectors, individuals, businesses, and government. Accountants do the same. So at a broad level, at a high level, our aims and objectives are very similar, but we just approach it differently because one is looking at it at a micro level and the other is looking at it at a macro level. And for me, this difference is in fact not a huge difference at all. I almost see it analogous to how we are currently using big data in forecasting. We listened to quite a few speakers talking about big data, but what the big data does is it takes all these micro level data and aggregates them to tell us something about the firm's revenues or earnings. And if you can do that with big data, why can't we see accounting numbers at the business level and do the similar things? Why can't we use accounting numbers to aggregate them to the higher level and provide us an indicator or a signal? Okay. Remember, the big data is not going to tell us an accurate measure of what's going to happen at the firm level. It is only intended to provide that one small marginal competitive advantage which others don't have. And that could also come from doing accounting work in macroeconomics better. That's what I see macroaccounting's role as. It's not as if it's going to change the whole field of macroeconomics or that we are stepping into macroeconomists and now we are all going to be called as macroeconomists who do accounting work. That's not the intention. It's can we use this information to get a small advantage to the users of the information. So let's see how we can get that kind of an advantage. And in this specific context, I'm going to start looking at what the drivers of GDP are. GDP is just essentially in the expenditures approach is defined as the consumption expenditures plus investments made by businesses plus net exports of businesses and the government expenditures. But if you look at the drivers of these, basically profits of firms matter for almost every one of them. A company makes profits, distributes it as dividends to consumers, and the consumers use it to buy goods. So that's consumption expenditure affected by how much business profits are. Because if the business profits go up, bonus compensations increase. So wages are also affected. Business profits go up, the amount of taxes paid to the government increases, and the government expenditure could increase accordingly. Okay? And these are all going to happen at the margin. I'm not going to suggest that, oh, this year the government has found a bonanza of corporate profits, so it's going to go on a spending spree. No. But at the margin, at a small level, these can matter. So profits do matter for the macroeconomy of any country. This does not miss the attention of macroeconomists, and that's why macroeconomists come up with this measure of profits from current production, and that's what is called as their corporate profits. Okay, I'm going to refer to that as NIPA profit, National Income Product and Accounts profit. What they do is they actually aggregate the tax returns. They get this information. Their corporate profit information is aggregated by getting tax returns of businesses. And you ask them, why do you use the tax returns? Almost always they'll say, financial returns are too subjective. They can all be manipulated, and all the time they are manipulated. We know that. Just see Enron cases and the WorldCom cases. They're not reliable. Which is very surprising for an accountant to hear, because from an accounting perspective, it is that subjectivity which is in accounting numbers which makes it attractive and useful for information or for decision-making purposes. And that's the reason we don't use these accounting numbers which are prepared in an objective way. So subjectivity in the accounting numbers is quite a useful thing, but economists like to throw them out. And they also like to throw out all these one-off items, saying that these are too transitory and they make the numbers very volatile. But again, as accountants, look at it and say that one-off item, the impairment charge or the restructuring provision, is actually informative because it tells us about something that the firm's business decisions are going to be in the future. So at one sense, if all this kind of information in accounting, the subjective information that's provided by accounting is relevant to a firm, and if each firm essentially aggregates to the macroeconomy, it seems surprising to throw that kind of information away. Maybe if we start to aggregate all that information, there's going to be some additional information, new pieces of data we have got, which is useful to predict GDP in the future, which corporate profits cannot do. And in fact, if you look at how the NIPA profits are prepared, the NIPA profits essentially come out about 2 or 3 years after the event has happened. So for 2015, the actual data will probably come out in 2018. But before that, NIPA profits are all provided on a preliminary basis. The preliminary bases are largely based on CompuStat data themselves. But if the macroeconomists are going to use CompuStat data, and they're also going to use additional data, I'm not suggesting that they use only CompuStat data. They'll use CompuStat data, but they also use past NIPA data, and they use some additional information to come up with these NIPA profits. If that's the case, why should we wait for that NIPA profits to come out? We can use our own CompuStat data to at least gather some of that information before it is formally released by the BEA. And that's what I see macro accounting's role as. Okay? And when we do that, we can actually come up with numbers that are available to us in a high frequency. We can create that kind of an aggregate CompuStat information almost on a daily basis. And in fact, that's what Bill Creedy and Gurun, in their paper, they take advantage of that by creating an aggregate earnings announcement shock on a daily basis and relating it to how the stock market returns on that particular day do. This is something you can't do with macro data, because macro data are typically available at best on a monthly level. And not only that, in fact, one of my own research with Oktay Urjan, we were looking at how the CompuStat aggregate profits translates to prediction of future inflation. And we were able to do that by using monthly level earnings data. We aggregated earnings of companies that were announcing on a monthly basis. And so we got a monthly series of corporate profit figures, and we looked at what happened to the next month's inflation. We did the same, and we found that there is actually an impact. There is a causal impact, because if companies are finding a profit shock and unexpected profits in one quarter, they adjust their investments quite quickly. And that investment increase causes an increase in the inflation in the next month. That is what our paper was showing. We tried to do a similar analysis using the macroeconomic corporate profits data, which are available on a quarterly basis, to try and see what was happening to the inflation in the future. And we didn't see much of an impact. In fact, the results were all insignificant. And the reason why we didn't see that impact is simply because corporate profits at a quarterly level are not still sufficiently granular. It's not sufficiently frequent enough to see the effect happening. These effects that we were able to report were happening from one month to the next. And if you use a quarterly data with macroeconomic scheduled information, that's not going to help you understand that question. So this is where I see accounting as stepping in. It comes in, provides more frequent data, provides additional bit of data, and that is the main advantage as I see with accountants stepping into the macroeconomic areas. The other advantage with accounting data is we have got analyst forecasts available for every firm. So in fact, we can compute profit shocks quite accurately at the firm level, and it's possible to aggregate the profit shocks of a firm and get a profit shock at a macro or an aggregate level profit shock as well. So this is yet another advantage that accounting data does have. What are the disadvantages? Okay, disadvantages, it's not always appropriate to aggregate data, as we heard from Mary. And there are also a few other, which is that firm-level data is only available typically for listed companies. So it's almost like we are seeing a small sample, and we have to now use that small sample to extrapolate to a larger population. We don't know how that will work. But that's not a reason for us not to get into it. It's a reason for us to say we need to understand better how this sample fits into the bigger population. So it's calling for me, it's saying that there is an opportunity out there for us to do better research, to be able to contribute more meaningfully in this field, rather than trying to say, sorry, this is no longer useful, I'm going to run away from there. A good example as to how we are contributing to the macro accounting literature is this quote that was provided in a Journal of Monetary Economics. It's a top macroeconomic journal. And in that, there is a statement which is saying macroeconomists are finding it hard to measure the factor incomes and consumptions. The proxies for aggregate tax rates on factor incomes and consumptions are not reliable. And any input into improving these measures would be very valuable. Okay? This is a paper that was in 1994, but that issue remains today for them. Okay? I've seen other citations in that. And this is where, in fact, if you look at macroeconomics literature, trying to study a very simple question, how does changing corporate taxes matter for the economic growth? The US made a huge change in the corporate taxes, and the claim by the politicians was this will boost the economy. Does it really boost the economy? And the way the macroeconomists, many of them have studied, this is not the only way they have done it. There are other approaches, including quasi-natural experiments that have been employed. But people who have done it using regression analysis have simply studied it by regressing statutory tax rates in a cross-country setting on growth in the GDP in that country, or future growth in GDP in that country. And what they typically found is sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. And they always used statutory tax rates in these kinds of analyses. And that's exactly what we tried to replicate. Myself, again, my co-author, Oktay, we did this replication, and we found that depending on what methodology you use, what kind of controls you put in, whether you're having firm fixed effects, how you cluster your results, the results can change dramatically. And you can get pretty much any result you want. So we couldn't rely on that much at all. But when we aggregate these effective tax rates, we accountants know that statutory tax rates are pretty useless to understand the firm incentives, tax incentives, they are driven by the effective tax rates, and that's what or the marginal tax rates as well. Okay? But when we do that, at the firm level, it's not being taken on into consideration when we do the macroeconomic analysis. And so here, when we repeated the same analysis using aggregated effective tax rates across listed companies, we find a very robust result that tax rates have a negative impact. The higher the effective tax rates, the more you force the companies to pay, the less the GDP growth rate is. And this is just a quick picture of what that paper is about. This is not the only thing that the paper contributes. Okay? I don't have time to go over all these accounting approaches, but we are making contributions to this field of macro accounting research in many ways. Some set of papers which are all using macroeconomic variables as the dependent variables. In these cases, they are all trying to say, can accounting numbers help us better predict the macroeconomic variables? Or can accounting numbers, when aggregated across all the listed firms, can they help us predict the macroeconomic forecast errors? Because not all macroeconomists are probably using these aggregated numbers. And so these kinds of work have already been done. There are also studies at the same time which are happening from a micro to an aggregate capital market work, whereby we are aggregating a lot of accounting items and seeing how the capital market, the stock market returns are affected by these aggregated accounting items. So you aggregate accruals, you aggregate earnings, you aggregate investments, you aggregate management forecast, and see how they predict or how they are related to contemporaneous market returns. I'm just suggesting these as some examples of ways in which accountants are contributing to the macroeconomic literature. And then there is also another set of studies where they are trying to understand the macro exposures of firms and their relation to how the stock market reacts to such macro exposures. So in these studies, they typically try to estimate what is the firm's exposure. Is there a systematic component, first of all, to earnings? And then if there is a systematic component, can we estimate a firm-level exposure to macro variables? And then how does the market react to these macro exposures? Does it incorporate the information in the macro exposures efficiently in the prices? So these kinds of questions are what we are currently contributing towards, and we are making a contribution. It's a start. I want us to realize that we have not made major advances here, but it's fantastic. What we are doing right now is fantastic. So what questions remain? Lots of questions remain. Okay. The first set of questions is, do aggregate earnings attributes matter? We as accountants are experts in analyzing each attribute, how each attribute matters for firm-level decisions. And if these attributes are going to matter for the firm-level decisions, and if, as I told you earlier, the firms essentially constitute what happens to the macroeconomy, the firms plus the government plus the individuals, I realize that, but the firms are key players in the macroeconomy. And if they are going to make the decisions which will matter for macroeconomy based on certain earnings attributes, so why don't we also see whether these earnings attributes aggregate to the macro level? Again, I know there are problems with simply aggregating these data. And Mary pointed out that, look, some of these timely loss recognitions is a good example. Conservatism. Can we aggregate conservatism across firms? And my response is, maybe not in a straightforward manner, but at the same time, I don't want to throw it out simply because I don't understand how the aggregation should be done. To give you an example, in the financial crisis, during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, we saw a lot of banks were writing off their loans. All those are what we would refer to as timely loss recognitions. Okay? There was impairments of assets. One way to think about it is to say, okay, I can't aggregate that information, so let me not use it. But the other way to see it is, well, that's useful information, because if banks are going to be affected in the future because of these write-offs, they are going to have an impact in the future macroeconomic performance as well. So I want to understand how much write-off has been happening. How do I aggregate them to understand it at the macroeconomic level? That's something where I'm hoping we can contribute in the future. We need to put in more thought into it. And that's exactly what I'm agreeing. So I'm agreeing with Mary in these aspects as well. We do a lot of work on earnings management. And if you start to aggregate earnings management at the firm level, it has to have an impact at the macroeconomic level. Does it signal us? Similarly, you can also do questions. You can ask questions about the dynamic relationships, the time series relationships between the macroeconomy and the aggregate accounting numbers. We have already shown in prior research that this relationship between aggregate earnings numbers and stock markets is quite time varying. And it shifts in a predictable manner at in certain regimes. That's all we know. We don't know why it happens. And in order to answer that question of why is it that this relationship is changing over time, we need to understand, first of all, a more basic question. What macro variables are important to determine a firm's earnings? We don't know that basic question because it's basic, but extremely difficult for us to answer. That answer will depend upon each firm. Each firm will have a different macroeconomic activity that is going to be more relevant to it. And each firm will also have a different relation to the macroeconomy depending on how much it has in terms of its hedging activities, risk management activities, so on. So it's a difficult question, but again, something we have to tackle if we want to make more meaningful progress in the macroeconomics area. And lastly, this is again going back to the question of how do we aggregate all that information. The way we can aggregate that information right now is done by, let's just take an equally weighted average or a value weighted average, because that's all we know. But we can do more research in this to be able to say, are there specific firm characteristics? We know from the existing literature that certain firm characteristics are more value relevant. Certain firm characteristics have bigger impact on the decisions of the firms. If those things are all mattering, why don't we take all those into consideration? And I like the work that Ryan, Lindsay, and Eric are doing. They were just talking about it, right? Where they were combining earnings smoothness with predicting the aggregate earnings. That's interesting again, but we can make more progress on that as well. All right. So with that, let me actually conclude. I don't have time. I'm running out of time, right? I've run out of time, actually, so let me skip all these challenges. It's up to you.
Perfect, thank you.
All right. So let me conclude by saying there is significant potential for accounting research to make an incremental contribution to macroeconomists. I don't see us as getting into their territory, and they don't need to find us as competitors, but rather as potential collaborators. And macro accounting is going to be helpful for addressing a variety of macroeconomic issues. The literature is still in its infancy. I can count with my fingers the number of papers that have been written in this literature. And if we want to grow this, we have got to be very careful to make sure that our growth is all coming from innovative work rather than trying to make some very small steps or by trying to replicate existing work in a slightly different context or using a slightly different macroeconomic variable as the dependent variable. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me to speak today. It's a great honor. I'm going to start with a question, too. Basically, what is macro? Starting off a little bit, I guess, basic. And when I want to know things, I do what every other academic does. I go to Wikipedia and look for a definition. Well, microeconomics is a branch of economics dealing with the performance, structure, behavior, and decision-making of an economy as a whole. Well, I don't know a lot of decision-making as an economy as a whole. We're not communist Russia yet. We're not doing what Putin all tells us to do to get a certain GDP. So it really is in individual firms or agents all acting, I don't know if to say independently, there's some correlations, but to maximize their own profits, and that's our macro. So it's a distribution. What macro is a distribution. Well, how do we measure the distribution? Gross domestic product, gross national product, we talked about those, industrial production, productivity, unemployment, aggregate earnings. Well, with one exception, and that's unemployment, these are basically average measures. We're basically just using a mean of a distribution to measure economic conditions. And does that mean that we view these two economies as the same? So I've got the same GDP, and I've got two economies. One of them, let's say it's 2% growth. In one economy, almost all firms are really close to that 2%, somewhere between 1% and 3%. And in another economy, we have a lot of really successful firms and a bunch of not so successful firms, okay? Are they the same? Based on measures of GDP, as I just noted, they are. Well, do we really view them the same? Do investors view them the same? Well, this is a joint work with Bjorn Jorgensen, who'll speak with you tomorrow, and Jing Li. And if you look at that minus 9.98, that negative correlation or between returns and future dispersion, it tells me that investors don't like it. They don't like dispersion. If I go back to the previous slide, they prefer the red to the yellow. Okay, they prefer that tighter economy to a more dispersed economy. And the question is why? And to my knowledge, and again, I'm happy to hear more if there are more, there's three main reasons. The first one is uncertainty, which I thought Bjorn Jorgensen will discuss tomorrow. He will not. So in brief, what I'll say is if you can look at Bloom's work, 2009 Econometrica, a more dispersed economy is one with higher uncertainty. We are less certain about economic growth when the economy is more dispersed. There's evidence of that in my work as well with Alon Kalai, Suresh Nalaraidu who is sitting there as well. We do find evidence of that. Okay, that's kind of in brief that entire theory. There is sectoral shifts. That's, I think, a fairly well-known theory in labor economics. This goes back to Lillian of 1982. Maria will speak about that coming up. And the last one, this is fixed income securities, banks, all of those. This is a recent working paper with Santi Gukusi, Koz John, and Suresh Radhakrishnan, a colleague of mine at UTD. So that said, let me move to the sectoral shift hypothesis. Why is a wide distribution of outcomes bad? And this is it's actually a very intuitive theory. It starts off with frictions in the labor market. We all know that it takes a long time to find a job. An employee needs to clean up the resume, go interview, find that matching between the employer and the employee. It takes a long time. That's why a full economy is never 0% unemployment. It's always somewhere between 3 to 6% unemployment is considered a full economy or full employment economy. So Lillian took that and said, well, so the main driver on unemployment is layoffs. What matters the most is how many employees are actually laid off. And you'll have more layoffs when the economic outcomes are more dispersed. Okay, so if I don't know what I did, but how do I do this? Full screen?
What is it? Control it on?
Okay, so if I take this economy and I said everybody to the left of the green line are the firms that have to lay off employees. Their performance are too poor, they have to lay off employees. So you can easily see that that yellow economy or the more dispersed economy are going to have more layoffs and therefore more unemployment. Again, a paper, recent data with Alon Kalai and Suresh Nalaraidu. If you look at that 13.44, that statistical significant coefficient, and also, again, extraordinarily high R squared, 0.16%, is explained by dispersion, how wide the economy is. In fact, it seems to be more important than the business cycles or the average that we spend so much time looking at. Okay, so that's one of the things that we found here. This is the sectoral shift. The other theory is, again, this is new. It's a working paper. It's not even submitted yet. It's all of these fixed income securities, and dispersion. So this is, we know this from, again, with all this discussion on conservatism in accounting. Bank's payoff function is asymmetric, or it's a concave payoff function. If I've got a mortgage, if I win the lottery tomorrow, the bank will get the interest and my mortgage back. If I lose my job, which is kind of difficult because I'm tenured, but if I try really hard and I ruin my house, the bank will lose. So there's an asymmetric payoff function. They're very sensitive to the negative side of the distribution. Okay, so for a bank, a wider distribution means more loan losses. And more loan losses means higher interest rates, which can impede investments and other things, so that has real implications. Okay, so the question is higher interest rates and higher loan losses, what's the overall effect on the bank? If dispersion is not fully predictable, you'd expect them to lose a little, and that's what actually happens. So bank performance overall is lower in periods of high dispersion. I don't have data on this. But if I just, this is, we show this analytically, but this is very intuitive, same type of figures, right? Bank performance or overall performance is that blue distribution. This is in a cross-section in 1 year. What is the losses? All the firms that can't make out the interest payments to the left of that red line. If I expand the distribution of outcomes, loan losses will rise. Okay? That's, I think, a fairly straightforward theory. And let's go to the data. We looked at aggregate loan loss provisions for banks, looking at average earnings, that's the aggregated, and then dispersion. By the way, I should have mentioned all of these things are AR shocks. So these are not just, serial correlation is not driving these results. And you can see that dispersion on its own explains 30% of aggregate loan loss provisions for banks. Okay, so how wide the economy is much more important than the mean of the economy, and explains much more of the loan losses for banks. By the way, both together, it's 40% R squared. So that's, again, I've done a lot of work in aggregates. You don't easily get those high R squares unless it's something very meaningful with two variables. We have much less data on the loan spreads, but as I said, if you have more loan losses, you do expect to get higher interest payments or the bank to charge higher interest, and we do find that as well. So in periods of high dispersion or high economic dispersion in outcomes, you have higher loan spreads on loans. Again, the same goes on portfolio, bond portfolio performance. So if we look at returns on dispersion, again, much less observations, but still almost 40% of variation in bond returns are explained by just how wide the distribution of outcomes in our economy. So even for 28 observations, that's quite a bit. Again, I share some of the views on forecasting. Is it that reliable? I get all of that, but we added that into the paper as well. Does dispersion predict some loan losses? This is quarterly analysis on loan loss provisions. 1 is 1 quarter ahead, 2 is 2 quarters ahead, 3 is 3 quarters ahead. We don't find anything on the annual level in predictability, so you can see that in the 4th quarter there as well. Dispersion does predict some future loan losses for banks. Okay. So now this is in my opinion, a more complicated problem. How do we actually compare economic conditions? That's what we care about. We want to explain, again, are we having a good economy or a bad economy? Well, if it's measured by GDP, that's fine. Higher GDP, we're good. Well, now we have higher GDP and higher dispersion. Is that good? It becomes much more complicated when I need to compare economies based on basically comparing distributions rather than comparing means, because that distribution is very meaningful. So what do I do with that? I don't really know. We have a few answers. We were trying to in some of the papers, and I'll tell you what we've gone to, but I actually am still not sure how we'd want to do that in the best way. But let me say what we did do. Okay, so this is that paper with Alon Kalai and Suresh Nalaredi. That is the point of the paper, is that an economy is basically jointly determined by a mean and a sigma. And what we've done is we just interacted the terms. So we took rev as the mean, dispersion, is that how wide the distribution is, add the mean, add the dispersion, and add an interaction term. Okay, that's one way to take into account that dispersion can have a different effect in different periods. What our bold coefficient there tells us is that the effects of dispersion, a wide economy is much worse when economic growth is slow. Okay, and I think that's intuitive. When it's a really fast-growing economy, a little bit of dispersion, I'm still doing great. Okay, but if the economic conditions are not that great and I have high dispersion, that's a lot worse. And that's pretty much what that coefficient there shows us. The same thing goes for banks and loan losses. You see the same type of, I guess, nonlinearities. As I said, we did show it analytically. You can kind of see it here. But if I just look at the data, and let me just explain it before. If at some point, higher dispersion for banks, because a bank can't lose more than 100%, higher dispersion just means more great performing firms. So it just curves down. Dispersion is not as negative. And if this is actual data, we look at loan losses, loan loss provisions, or in this case, net charge-offs, and you see that curve. So dispersion is worse, but at some point, when the economy is, it doesn't have that negative effect that much. So it does curve out. So again, those nonlinearities or that joint determination seems to be a big deal. And again, that is my main conclusion from what we've done so far. If I'm trying to understand economic conditions, going back to the first talk we had in the morning, micro, macro, well, macro is a distribution of micro. And if I want to understand economic conditions overall, I need to understand the distribution. Well, again, we don't necessarily have a normal distribution. At the very least, I would expect us to look at a mean and a sigma when we're looking at distributions. And that seems to make a big difference in terms of understanding, again, unemployment, banking performance. If you want to understand some of the loan losses during the financial crisis, look at dispersion during the financial crisis. So again, a lot of stuff would be explained if we look at an economy as jointly determined by a mean and a sigma. Again, we are supposed to talk a little bit about future work. My view has always been the best future work is the one that I didn't talk about. You're giving me something new. But just as a few things, as I said, we tried. I would love to develop a better, more comprehensive measure of economic condition. What exactly, what is a good economy, what is a bad economy, but using a distribution rather than a mean? Is a recession just 2 consecutive negative quarters, or is it a low enough growth with enough dispersion? Would that be bad enough? What exactly is good, what exactly is bad? Again, as I said, I don't know. It'd be good if open to suggestions. We also know very little on the determinants of dispersion. What is actually causing economic dispersion? What is the reason for it? Is it predictable? As I said, going back to this is a research in its infancy that we are, and I'll keep it in there because I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, so I'm going to also start by thanking the organizers for the invitation to present and talk about my work out here. And I have to say that I was listening to the keynote speaker and the first panel discussion about the big questions that are really challenging. And I thought, oh my God, my research really doesn't address any of this. So I would say that probably what I'm going to talk about is not so much about like big challenging opportunities about research in micro versus macro, but more about feasible opportunities for research, something that I've been working on. And I'm going to start with, I'll start and finish. I'm going to have just 2 points. So one is that if you look at the composition of the gross domestic income, which is a GDP equivalent, so you can see that the corporate profit slice of it is 11%. Okay, so while a lot of the discussion here is about the aggregation, and what is the purpose of aggregation? Is it to measure the slice better? Okay, and this is an important task, perhaps. But if you look at the entire economy, then other components are just as important and probably more important than corporate profits. So part of my research has been on trying to figure out how can we use accounting information to make inferences or make predictions about the rest of the economy or economy as a whole. Okay, and you can see that the biggest piece of the economy here is the compensation of employees, or in other words, labor markets are a very important part of the economy. And so I'm going to talk about first the work that's work in progress. So this is a working paper that's still undergoing a revision process, so it's going to change over time. So this is a working paper co-authored with Rebecca Han and Chong Lee, and Rebecca is, of course, here today. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how can we use accounting information, so profitability measures from corporations, and how can we infer from this something about the conditions of the labor market, or maybe predict the labor market somehow. And we borrow the theories from the labor economics. And what the theory suggests is that the adjustment of employment at the firm or establishment level has a big fixed cost component. So what it leads to is the lumpiness in the employment adjustment. So the firms would go for a long time without making significant changes in the number of employees, and then suddenly they would either increase the number of employees by a lot or decrease the number of employees by a lot. And we draw from this the conclusions for how we can use accounting information to therefore infer how the companies are going to go about hiring or firing their workers. And because of this fixed component and lumpiness, we conclude that it should be the persistent component of earnings that is more important, because a $1 shock to a persistent earnings stream is likely to infer you about a larger change in the value of the company, and this would be more likely enough for the company to overcome the fixed cost of the adjustment of unemployment and hire or fire more workers. And so what we do is we look at the aggregate level of GAAP earnings, and we decompose GAAP earnings into components. So we decompose it in what we call core earnings, which we think is more persistent, and the parts that are less persistent, and in particular we look at the special items and some other components too. And so this is just a snippet of our results. So we don't do anything fancy in terms of the analysis at this point. So what we do is we try to predict the labor market aggregates using these components of earnings. And the table on the left here is our prediction of the compensation of workers, part of the GDI. And so what we find, and this is the regression that has many controls in it, many other macroeconomic variables, we find that it is really the case that the core earnings are more important predictors of labor compensation. And also we have other analyses showing that other labor market aggregates, such as aggregate job creation and job destruction, are more predictable using the persistent earnings. And then we take it to the unemployment forecasts. And what we find is that it's also useful to forecast the future unemployment. And then we also show that the macroeconomic forecasts, so the survey of professional forecasters of unemployment, do not take this information into account fully. Okay? So it is really, and I think I want to address one of Shiva's concerns, is that a lot of research in this area, what they do is they take dependent variable, which is one macroeconomic indicator, and then they plug a different macroeconomic indicator, and lo and behold, they find also some results. And I just want to say that what we find is really concentrated in the labor market, okay? Because there's contemporaneous work and something that we replicate. So Abdallah and Karbias have a paper that show that if we try to forecast GDP, and we also show corporate profits, this persistent component for earnings matters less. Okay, so it really is about something about the labor market that makes this component more informative. So I wanted to mention this research, although this is just work in progress, because I really think that there is a lot of opportunities here, both at the micro and macro level. When we started looking at the link between accounting and labor markets, it turned out that there's very little research on this. So we don't know much about how the financial performance of firms is going to affect the employment decisions at the micro level. What exists out there is mostly in the context of the large-scale layoffs when the company is restructuring or downsizing, and there is very little of this. Or there's labor market for the corporate executives, which is of course also very limited. So I think that given the size of the labor income and its role in the entire macroeconomy, it's very important to explore those issues. So another issue I wanted to touch upon and has to do with the potential for the policy implications or the economic significance of the findings that we have here. And so I'm going to talk about a paper, that's a published paper that's co-authored with Suresh Nalreddy, who's here today. So here we use a setting of the macroeconomic restatements or revisions. And this has been mentioned in the previous panel when the Bureau of Economic Analysis releases the initial estimates for the GDP. And it usually happens like within 3 weeks out of the quarter ends. The first initial estimates are based on incomplete and imprecise information. So to put this in a context for the accountants in the audience, this would be like there's a corporation that has 5 segments and it has to release its earnings and it only heard from 3 out of 5 segments with their financial information. And the rest has to be extrapolated through sophisticated statistical process, but nonetheless, these numbers, therefore, are imprecise and they have to be restated afterwards. And so what I put there on the slide is the last 40 years of the revisions for the nominal GDP growth, and you can see that they have been significant, and some of them are sometimes very significant. Like, for example, the first quarter of 2008, this is when the initial estimate was positive 3%, and then it was later revised to a negative figure. So the goal of that project was to try and figure out, can we use accounting information somehow to improve the precision of the early GDP estimates? And we use the same theory that Gail has already alluded to. So in terms of the accounting information, we use this dispersion of earnings growth across the firms. And the idea is, of course, that if there are some firms performing very well and other firms poorly, workers will tend to move from poorly to well-performing firms, and this is not frictionless, so it takes time. Unemployment goes up in the interim, and unemployment and GDP growth are negatively correlated. So our main result is that it is indeed the case that when earnings dispersion is higher, the subsequent restatements of GDP growth are more negative, they are lower, which makes sense. So if earnings dispersion is high, it means that the unemployment is going to rise in the future, and if GDP estimates that are early releases don't take this into account, they're going to be restated downwards over time. So, but what I want to hone in is not so much this result, although I was very excited to find it, but more the economic significance assessment of this and the potential policy implications. So we were very concerned about this result, trying to figure out first whether this is something useful, whether this can be done in real time. So whether an outside agency can take the early release being Bureau of Economic Analysis numbers, and they can adjust it using our suggested adjustment. And 2, how economically significant the difference to the adjustment is going to be. So the first thing we did was we did the real-time out-of-sample exercise of predicting restatements, and they are predictable in real time using information that's available there. And the second thing that we did was we tried to take this to the policy or regulatory setting and try to figure out whether the adjustment that is feasible using accounting information is economically significant. And we do have 2 settings in the paper. I only have time to talk about one of them. So we took it to the Basel III regulations, which are not enforced yet, so all of our analysis is just counterfactual. But one part of Basel III that was really interesting to us is that there is a countercyclical buffer. And depending on the existence of the countercyclical buffer, the capitalization requirements for banks are going to be higher or lower. So if the buffer is in place, capitalization requirements are higher. And the important thing here is that there is a hardwired nominal GDP estimate that goes into determination whether the buffer is in place. And so what we tried to do was we compared nominal GDP estimates for the early released number versus the final release number that is something that is reflecting the true state of the macroeconomy. And then we did the early release with our adjustment, which, as we showed, is feasible in real time. And what we found was that If you use the adjustment, it's a very simple exercise, so we're not suggesting the regulators actually use it. So in terms of calibration, if you do so, then there's going to be quarters when the capitalization requirements are going to be significantly different based on the adjustment. I'm not going to show you the entire table, so this is just for one quarter. So this is a fourth quarter 2004. So had Basel III been in place at that time, the countercyclical buffer would kick in. And so for the initially announced GDP figure, this would mean that the banks would have to either raise more capital and they would have to cut back on lending to maintain this minimal capitalization requirements that takes into account the buffer. And if you would have adjusted this initial GDP number using our adjustment, it would bring it closer to the final true estimate of the underlying aggregate economy, and this would lead to a low cutback in the lending, so to the tune of $10 to $18 billion, which we thought was a pretty significant, economically significant number for a simple adjustment based on a simple publicly available information that the accountants provide. So, and I wanted to put it out here because I think there's a lot of settings where the measurement issues are important. And although I realize that the regulators and the policymakers don't just take these numbers and plug it in and have a hard and fast rule for making decisions, it is still, I think, important to think about this. And this could lead to further research, I hope, and it would be really nice if the research in this area would think about those practical implications and would provide those calibration exercises to show just how important these measurement issues are. And with this, I'm done. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Thanks to all the presenters for their interesting presentations. When showing that accounting-based information predicts macro, typically, I think in several of the tables that went up there, we have a control for sort of standard market-based predictors. So is the story when accounting aggregates predict macro beyond markets that there's a market inefficiency, or is it that we're just not looking at the right metric based on market prices in predicting macro? I mean, intuitively, there's a lot of evidence that returns, credit spreads, etc., predict macro. Now, incrementally, is it that we're just not capturing all the information in market prices in the controls, or is it that there's a market inefficiency?
Okay, I'll take that bullet. So I guess your question is what, I mean, there are two parts of it here. First of all, I think it is really important to show that accounting does have an incremental information content, and we were very careful to try to show this in our research. So we do control for a whole host of various macroeconomic indicators. The second part is, I think there are some features of accounting that are pretty unique. Okay, so for example, in our paper where we look at the dispersion of the profitability across firms, because we want to look at this potential for moving of the workers across the firms, we do control for dispersion in returns, for example, and it is not as predictive as dispersion in profits. And one reason we think this could be happening is because returns is a composite measure of a lot of things. So if discount rates go up or down, for example, there is going to be an effect for the dispersion of returns, and it does not necessarily get at this potential for earnings dispersion, which would, we think, lead to this movement of workers across the economy. So I guess to answer your question shortly, I do think that there are unique things that the accounting conveys in terms of information that other measures, including stock returns, don't really capture.
If I just can add to it, I actually looked at predicting the T-bill market in one of the studies that I was doing with Octay. And the reason I chose the T-bill market is not a very volatile market. And predicting in that market is extremely difficult. And in that market, we could predict with aggregate earnings. And that was a bit of a surprise. And we predicted it's essentially two bases. One standard economic magnitude was one standard deviation increase in shock was changing the credit spreads by not the credit spread, but the T-bill yield by 2 basis points. Okay? So 2 basis points is extremely tiny, but in practice, that's a big advantage still for the traders. And what I think was happening, we tried quite a few things and that result was there. And one of the things I think is happening is a lot of the times people just ignore accounting numbers saying, I don't want to aggregate accounting numbers and use them because these are too granular. It's not going to make much of a difference at all. So over time, if we are able to show that aggregating accounting numbers just provide this incremental information, it could change it. But right now, there seems to be some evidence, and I am at least right now convinced, yes, there is some market inefficiency. Whether this is all sufficient to overcome the transactions cost, I'm not sure about it. Okay? But there is some evidence that markets are not fully utilizing all that information.
I have a sort of a question and a comment. It would be useful, I think, in this literature to try to tie these cross-sectional characteristics of the distributions more tightly to the experiences that individual actors are kind of playing in the economy and their own distributions and how they might be changing. Because cross-section doesn't necessarily have a direct implication for how, for example, the distribution of my income is going to unfold. And there's a parallel literature that you might want to connect with in macroeconomics finance that looks at the changing distribution of incomes or consumptions in incomplete markets and shows that the higher moments of the consumption process can have a really big effect on how individuals behave in incomplete markets, which can have major effects on the equilibrium asset returns that you're then trying to see whether or not they're predictable using this information. So tying up with that literature and looking at those higher order moments explicitly in incomplete markets would, I think, sort of pull all these literatures together.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, I think we have one more question, and then we'll have lunch. Dennis?
So this is a comment. So if you look at GDP statistics and you look at GDP by state, you already see the importance of a distribution there. So we always do the distribution of that. So if you took earnings and put location into it, it'd be very interesting to see how that affects things. The United States is a very big country, so even getting a cross-section of dispersion of earnings nationally doesn't really do a lot. It's by location, by state that would matter a lot. Same with compensation. We've already shown that distribution of income by region matters, and so compensation here is also very regionally dependent. So you might find that if you put location into that, you're going to get much more interesting results about economic performance.
Okay, thank you to the panel for putting all this work in, and it's lunchtime.